Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody out there in podcast land. This is Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. I am Hamza.
And I am David.
And for many people that have been listening to our podcast for some time, we're now at our 40th podcast, so we're really excited about that and look forward to 40 more. And when we started our podcast, one of our first episodes was God Winks, and we're talking about a lot of synchronicity. And I bring it up because today we are meeting with author Allen Vaysberg, and he's the author of the New Love Triangle book. But I bring that up because we've been getting a lot of people in the IT realm, and it's really interesting because when we go into the IT realm or digital realm, we don't usually think we talk about intrinsic motivation or anything like that. It's usually a totally different world. And so I'm really excited to speak with best-selling author Allen Vaysberg. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I think the rest of the conversation will probably go in ones and zeros, I imagine.
That's the only way we're going to talk for the rest of the podcast. And I see that you're in Illinois. We're here in Atlanta, David and I. And here in Atlanta, we usually say there's Atlanta's a transplant city, so a lot of people aren't from here. I'm from Jersey. David's from California. And we usually say there's about 3 Atlantas. There's pre-Olympics, there's post-Olympics, and then there's pre-recession and post-recession. And then for this podcast, we usually say pre-2012, post-2012. Mm-hmm. And reading some of your background, it seemed like, the Hollywood movie, my parents are immigrants. I pulled myself by the bootstraps, my business partner and I bought my first luxury SUV, had a wife, family, picket fence, but I wasn't happy. Something was still missing. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, everything except for the picket fence because the community that I live in, they wouldn't allow us to put fencing. But everything else certainly does. And I love Atlanta, by the way. I'm not just saying that because you guys are there, but I have quite a few friends and relatives that live in Atlanta in the Alpharetta area. I've been there many times. It's one of the cities that I actually imagined myself living in one day, but never pulled the trigger, and now we're so deep-rooted in Chicago that I don't think it's happening.
It's funny you say that because, Atlanta and Chicago usually fight for the number one most trafficked airport in the world. And in Atlanta, we always say, if you die and go to hell, there's a layover in Atlanta.
Yeah. If not, there's definitely one in Chicago, but then you'll probably stay there.
Yeah.
Something will be canceled, and then you'll have to pay for your overnight stay or something.
Yeah, anyway, absolutely.
Getting back to picket fences, it definitely, something happened around the 2012, and it wasn't what most people were thinking about, but in terms of the energy, something shifted. And I found myself in a similar boat to a lot of people, apparently in Atlanta as well, but it's been a very peculiar time of having early midlife crisis, as I call it, of trying to figure out who we are and why we're here, and have we actually done anything about it?
Are you familiar with, I'm sure you are, with Tim Ferriss and the 4-Hour Workweek?
Yes, I keep searching for it, but I haven't been able to quite do that yet.
He's a best-selling author, but I bring it up because he kind of changed the paradigm from a intrinsic motivation standpoint, from a this is what you can do standpoint, and I bring it up because you said this is kind of like an early midlife crisis, and the premise of his book was, before the book had come out, I am going to work at ABC Company for 30 years. I'm going to retire, get the gold watch, and then live my retirement. And he introduced more of the life hack where you can take mini vacations, mini retirements, and kind of just turn your life on edge instead of waiting until you're twilight years to live life to the fullest. So it seems like the paradigm's going to change where you may say traditionally it was a midlife crisis, but I'm having multiple midlife crises.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that, and so would my wife, unfortunately. But yes.
So before you go into that, for the book purpose, was the SUV really a convertible sports car since it was a midlife crisis?
No, actually it was an Audi Q5. It was a brown color, very, very pretty car. I don't have it anymore. I have another luxury SUV now. I traded that one in and got a Lexus RX 350 instead. But it's also brown, to my wife's dismay. That's the second time I mentioned something about my wife. So I guess we're going to talk about relationships soon.
Somewhat. A little bit, because you have a book called The New Love Triangle, and that is a very saucy, energetic title that has a lot of different connotations. What made you think of the title in the first place?
It was, I actually, as funny as I think I am, and as witty and, multidimensional humorist as I wish myself to be, I really did not start out that way. It was not, I'm going to come up with something provocative that people are going to buy because it's just going to be so interesting. It was really just thinking things through. I thought, I'm writing about the 3 types of love. And my brain always goes into patterns, into some sort of symbolism. And I thought, a circle, that makes sense. A triangle, 3 triangle. Hey, that's cool. 3 love. Wait, love triangle? Well, that really has a different connotation, but that could be it. I could change the paradigm, and I can have, instead of the old love triangle, I can have the new love triangle, and that's how everything kind of started. But I did put that in knowing full well that some people will look at it and say, nope, not interested in this book, and some people will take a look and be surprised.
There's a saying that everything in life is as it appears to be, and there's nothing in life that appears to be. So you're kind of playing with, a traditional. What is your take on the traditional love triangle or traditional balance to make things work, and how you've turned it on its edge?
Yeah, so those 2 different questions there, but in terms of the traditional love triangle, we've not that we've all experienced it, but we've certainly all been exposed to it either through our friends or through movies that we've watched or through dreaming about some sort of a saucy thing to add to the relationship. Of course not in my relationship, honey, if you're listening. I've never, ever thought about that. No, so it's... to me, it's more interesting of why people want to do that. And as I started kind of working with people from the coaching perspective, and as I started really working with myself, I understood why people would be interested in something like that and why it most of the time does not work. So my idea on the traditional love triangle is if you're searching for it, there are some questions you need to ask yourself before you actually do that have nothing to do with the triangle, that have everything to do with you and your relationship with yourself. And then if you answer that question and you still want to do it and your partner is into it, then go forth and enjoy. In terms of changing the paradigm and focusing on the 3 types of love that I am referring to in the book, for me it was somewhat of a lifesaver because my wife and I speak different love languages. And I learned that, and in order to deal with it, I had to kind of start to learn how to love myself. And that's where the process started. And then from there I went on, and that actually starts with the first type of love that the New Love Triangle talks about.
So, Allen, for those that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, where are you originally from, and up to this point now in your life, what's been going on?
Yeah, I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States at the age of 14 in 1989. I am from a country that no longer exists. It's like the Atlantis. It's a mystery. USSR is a former country. I am from the Ukraine part of it. Russian is my native language. And I came here with my parents kind of seeking a better life. So I'm the traditional immigrant story, driven to succeed. Parents bring me here because they wanted something better for me. And it's been somewhat of a crazy driving influence in my life of I need to make something of this life because they sacrificed everything for me. And, I came here, wanted to be a professional tennis player, a actor, both of which my parents said, no, get a real job, which I tried to. And I was a recruiter. I thought about becoming a lawyer, and I ended up in IT. I had my first business, did really well until September 11th. Then I had $300,000 of the personal debt that I had to pay down. So I started another business, paid that off, made some money. Then finally in 2012, I said, that's it. I can't do this anymore because I was never really into IT. I just loved being an entrepreneur, and I needed to find myself. That's when I wrote my first book, not this one. I did a movie. I finished Second City. I got my black belt and started kind of doing things and exploring and understanding who I am and what I choose to be. And then, of course, got back into IT at some point because money had to still come from somewhere. And it's this flow. It's the ebb and flow of life where I know now who I am. And now it's about figuring out how to translate that fully into a replacement of income rather than working in IT.
Mm-hmm. So just real quick, you mentioned you got your black belt. What art was that in?
It's kind of a combination. The official thing, it's in WUCA, W-U-C-A-A. It's the world something of the combat arts. But in essence, it's my trainer is a former Russian guy who was training Spetsnaz and the elite paramilitary people, and he has his own style that combines all sorts of different techniques. So think of it as mixed martial arts that are used by paramilitary forces, which makes me kind of afraid of myself as I'm saying that, but in reality, it means absolutely nothing. It's I look at it more as an honorary title of I've earned it, almost getting my eye poked out with a knife, and at some point I said, okay, that's enough. So I did get my black belt. It's that nudge that I have for myself, and God, willing, I never get into a fight.
I imagine Sambo was part of that training.
Yes, Sambo, it's basically a combination of different styles of Kung Fu that are, very specifically in terms of, instead of focusing on forms, it's very specific related to combat. You can use some boxing. There is some Sambo and jiu-jitsu techniques, but one of the trainers that we worked with is a world champion, many times world champion in Sambo. He actually lives here as well in Chicago. Very, very nice, kind of a gentle giant. The guy who's about, I think he's 6'4", weighs about 350, if not more. And we had to practice, which was really, really comical, of how he pretended that we can actually throw him, and how by moving a finger we would fly to the other end of the ring.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I myself am a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so yeah. So I'm familiar with. I know Sambo's very close to Jiu-Jitsu, very similar and stuff. So okay, cool.
So with the belts, I mean, I would look at it as, what resonates with me is being a type A. Like, I couldn't stop at the white belt. I have to go to yellow and through the whole thing and do the black belt. So did you feel like your goal was met, or what was your next wave in addition to getting your black belt?
It was not getting killed or injured in the process. That's really what my goal was. It was more of an ego-driven thing for me specifically of, as a man, I need to know how to defend myself, and I need to know how to shoot a firearm, and I need to know how to fight in case of an emergency situation. And then once you start getting into the ring with people who are really serious about that, you realize that it doesn't matter what belt you are, they're going to kill you. I remember specifically where one gentleman came in who is a paramilitary guy, served in places that he wasn't allowed to talk about, and one of our senior members was basically sparring with him, and I was standing really close, and I basically looked at the eyes of that paramilitary member as he looked at one of my classmates, and I wanted to run away, literally. Looking at his eyes, that it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter how many of you are there, you're not going anywhere. You're dead. Just in his eyes alone. It's that time where you know, okay, I am so happy I'm not doing this for real. So black belt to me was one of the things that my instructor said, at this point you're a black belt, and that's how I got it. But I never thought that I actually deserve it. But I do have it. It has my name on it. My son thinks it's the coolest thing ever, and I'm getting some points from that.
Nice. So I have a question about the love triangle. In 2017, I actually just last night I had watched, I like this TV show called Bull. Are you familiar with the TV show Bull?
Oh, I just watched the latest episode this morning. I love Bull.
Perfect. Okay, great. So this kind of goes, that's where my question is going, because if you talk about a love triangle, you're thinking about, yourself and maybe two other people. And in his case, he had his own version of a love triangle in that he loved his job so much. And unfortunately, his spouse had passed, and he really devoted more time. You would say he was unbalanced so much so that his 9-year-old daughter sought to get a divorce for him just because he wasn't around. Do you work with people in trying to figure out the current love triangle that they're going through, trying to manage work and personal time?
Yeah, it's a separate part of the practice. Excuse me. And we're talking Bull, and we're talking my practice. My practice is quite a bit different from Dr. Bull. In terms of the working with people, a lot of the issues that come up is the work-life balance. And, you encounter a lot of people who are definitely overworked, and they negate other parts of their lives because they're very driven. And I find that people in different ages either focus, most of their efforts in their career and then, try to make up for it during the weekend with their family, or they're having a hard time dealing with it. A lot of women are kind of put in an environment where they are very focused on succeeding, and they're very focused on growing in the corporate ladder and dealing with all of the males that kind of get in the way sometimes, and I've certainly encountered that in my clients, that it takes them away from the balance. So it's not just men, it's really all across the board. And then you have to deal with what is important to you, and what is the definition of enough. And it's not necessarily money, it's more respect, it's dealing with achievements, and what do you want out of life. So getting to the very existential questions of what is life about and what you want out of it, and then how to put things into perspective and a balance. So it's definitely not an easy process, and it really is almost irrelevant as to what anybody else has to say to them. It has to come from within. And at some point they realize that this is something that I need to change. Otherwise I will miss out on things that I care about more. And when you have that, that's when you can actually get through and do something about it.
Interesting.
Good point.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, in working with people and some of the stuff and problems they have in their relationships and whatnot, do you find that there's some common things in regards to people maybe in their 20s as opposed to their 30s or 40s or 50s?
Yeah, I certainly do. And again, a lot of the problems are more societal in the way that we've all grown up, because we have certain expectations of where we're going. We finish college, this is what we're going to be doing. And people get into that mode. And then all of a sudden they start realizing, why am I doing this? or I know I'm doing this, but is this really what I want to do? So people are asking themselves that question. It's not usually something that happens in the 20s. Although with the generation that's coming up now, it has been changing. Millennials are asking a lot more of these questions earlier. Most of the people, I'm 42 years old, so most of the people that are kind of in my age group started asking themselves that question, 37 going up. But when it comes to the relationship specifically, we deal with the questions of being happy in a relationship. And I've reached that point in my life where the 50% of people who are about to get divorced are getting divorced. And in my circle. So some people are married, some people already got divorced, some people are getting divorced right now. And you're starting to really appreciate why they're doing that. And a lot of it has to do with people just growing apart. So then the questions are, why are people growing apart? When you're saying that you're unhappy in a relationship, what does that really mean? Have you dug deeper enough into it? Not that I can talk to my friends about it, because at that point it doesn't matter, and they're not at a level of emotional capacity to really think those aspects through. It's more of, I'm unhappy, I need to get out. So it's not that with the people that are closest to you, you can actually save marriage, or at least I have not been able to, but it's more being supportive in that regard. From the client's perspective, you tend to get through a little more, but it really all starts dealing with who are you, what do you want out of life, and if you cannot focus on yourself, you're going to search for those answers outside of yourself, and usually that's not a good idea.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. So I imagine all your clients are here in the United States, I imagine, but around the world, concepts of relationships aren't all the same. So I don't know if you work with, people outside of the country, or if it's just here. But if you do, I was just, what are your experiences? Because you might say, people in this country, they see relationships totally like this, so your approach might be completely different as opposed to, this country or somewhere else.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. In my practice, in my experience, I have worked with people outside of the United States, but we can consider it more United States-like because I work with English-speaking people. So I have some clients from Australia, I have some clients from Canada, I have some clients from UK, but I haven't found too many differences in terms of relationship dynamic there. Being from another country and kind of growing up in the former Soviet Union, I have a lot of people in my suite of acquaintances that are in the same mode in terms of growing up somewhere else and then coming to the U.S. And I don't remember seeing the differences growing up there, nor do I remember seeing them here. There were differences, but they were more specific to the time growing up in, as in, was more men-dominated as opposed to women-dominated. Men worked, women stayed more at home or worked less. In terms of the relationship dynamic, things started shifting, but I think it's shifting, at least from the people that I have dealt with, it's shifting for everybody that I have talked to, and there is a lot more of the actual empowerment of women that's starting to come into play, but I've seen that everywhere. So I would say it's more times rather than location.
Yeah.
Now, Allen, with your background in IT and you deal with relationships, I have a two-part question. One was, since you did see the TV show Bull last night or this morning, in the gentleman's mind, he felt that he had the top-of-the-line security system with cameras everywhere, and that should be able to take care and watch his daughter in case something happened, right? And obviously that didn't work because there was an over-reliance on technology. So from an IT standpoint, I do want to get your take on just the relationship dance, because in 2017, there is a greater reliance on the technology and online dating versus going out the traditional route and meeting people in person. What's your take on that?
So again, two-part question. Let me address the first part initially. With the father in that particular episode, he focused on the traditional male aspect of protection. What he wanted to make sure is that he was the provider and the protector of the little girl, the 9-year-old, who, by the way, is like a carbon copy of my daughter's friend. I was watching that thinking, oh my God, I need to call Kate right now because she has a sister apparently. But in that way, what he forgot, the father forgot the actual relationship, and he couldn't bring himself up because that was the role that the mother played in there. The relationship aspect is why the daughter wanted to divorce herself from the father. It was because she was not getting the actual relationship. She wasn't worried about the protection of it. She just needed her father. She literally needed somebody to be with her, as Bull discovered. As in regards, to the online dating, I'm actually a huge fan of it because there are different people. Some people are much more social, some people are not. And as we are evolving with the technology, it's giving us a lot more reach and ability to get in touch with people. Because traditionally, beforehand, people were living in smaller communities and everybody knew each other. So it was much easier to get to know someone and to understand whether you're compatible because you're always around and you're growing up in that small community, or your parents are friends and you meet at social functions. Whereas right now, that's simply not the case. But the technology and all of these sites are allowing people to take a different look. Now, unfortunately, a lot of it is not truthful. So people on their profiles are not necessarily talking about themselves. But when they do, that interaction starts, and then they do meet in person. So I'm a big proponent of utilizing technology if that is the way for you to discover somebody who you choose to date. Especially right now, where unfortunately we're not living in times that are, wonderfully open and very trusting of strangers. So ability to communicate with somebody online and then via technological advances such as Skype or any other platforms, FaceTime, where you can see the person and speak to the person before you meet them, allows people to get to know each other in a more comfortable setting before they meet in person. So I have no problems there, as long as people are being truthful. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste of everybody's time and just a plain vanity.
Okay.
Did you see the movie Her?
I have not. Remind me, is this the movie where the AI was coming to life and he fell in love with his artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm familiar enough with the concept, and I've obviously seen the previews, but I have not seen the movie. I certainly could understand how that could happen, so I wouldn't be surprised by that.
That's why I wanted to ask you. You didn't have to see the movie since you know the what it's about. I had just recently finished the book Butterfly Effect, and in the book and it wasn't the movie that had come out maybe I think 10 years ago with Ashton Kutcher, but in this book they had looked at, since we're talking relationships, in the book they had talked about how the adult industry had pretty much changed the dynamic on dating, and they were looking at young, late teenagers, early 20-somethings, and they were more so not even interested. Well, not that they weren't interested in their female counterparts, but they were like, you know what, I get a better experience online or with dealing with an AI. And as an older person, I'm in my 40s, so I'm just like, wow, what do you see as the future propagating if there's a greater reliance on technology?
Well, I may be different in that regard, but the older I get and the more I understand life, the more I see that life is a combination of everything. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. You have the good, the bad, you have the ugly and the beautiful. You have everything that's available to you, and it's just a matter of our focus and concentration on a aspect of it. So with technology, as things are evolving, more things are allowing people to experience. And what they will get a chance to experience in this particular setting with an AI, it's a much more safe environment because they know they're not going to get turned down. And with men, we all remember growing up. We remember how difficult it was for us to approach a young lady that we liked and tell her that we like her, hoping not to get a rejection. So in this case, they know that they're not going to get rejected, so it's a lot more convenient and comfortable. That being said, they're missing a lot of the other aspects of that interaction. So they will get there eventually where, obviously some needs are going to be met, but there is no exchange and there's no algorithm for human interaction. So AI will approach it to a certain extent, but it's not going to happen. Or these people will not realize all of the wonderful intricacies of a human relationship. So it's just a part of our overall human experience. I don't think where some people definitely will take advantage of it, other people won't. It's like the men being afraid that with so much sex toys being available out there that men are going to be replaced in terms of a sexual partner. Well, it's not happening. It won't happen. As I think in one of the movies, somebody said, you can't bring that to your mom and say, this is who I'm marrying. It's a combination of things that we try, but we're always going to get back to what was actually meant to be, which is actual human interaction between two people.
Awesome.
Yeah. I like what you said about algorithm for human reaction and human interaction. I thought that was a great buzz term. And you had mentioned earlier that when you see the divorce rate or what have you at the rate that it is, you said typically 37 and above. And my take on that is prior to 37, there's an old template. Like you said, I'm going to go to school and then, maybe go to grad school and I'm going to work and get a house and then get married. And then I'm middle management in my mid to late 30s. And I'm like, is this all life has to offer? And it seems like, I guess we need people like you as an expert to kind of use that algorithm for human interaction to take us to the next level. Because I think people don't have a template.
Actually, you're absolutely correct, except for the last part. We do have a template, and any expert worth their salt can only do one thing, which is to guide them back to themselves. The template is there, and once they start diving in and once they start asking themselves the hard questions that they don't want to ask themselves, and then starting to work with it, then everything comes into focus and it becomes actually quite simple. So that's what I do. I do not tell people what they should be doing. My goal is to get them back in touch with themselves because they have the answers. They know why they're here. By here, I'm talking about in this particular lifetime, and yes, I believe in multiple lives. They know what they're supposed to be doing, what their life purpose is. They know what works and doesn't work in their relationship, and they really intrinsically know why it doesn't. So my goal is to make them to realize that and then to decide if they choose to do something about it. And then, of course, I have things that can help them along the process, but the idea is the same. All the books, all the experts, everybody is just leading you back to you.
You have the term, the mechanism of spirit, mind, and body. What exactly do you mean by that?
So, we've all heard the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We've all heard that the number 3 is of significance. We've heard the body, mind, and spirit. And what occurred to me in meditation one day, and I tend to believe that the information came from somewhere. And that's why I kind of wrote that article and I shared it. But what occurred to me is that the issue with us is that we tend to forget that there are 3 main factors, and we tend to just focus on the body. We kind of not that we're ever cut off, but we kind of cut ourselves off and we just focus on that. And that's not how we were created. Now, again, I am this woo-woo guy as well, so I'm the IT woo-woo guy who's spiritual, who's just as comfortable talking about angels and spirituality as he is talking about sports. But in the if you humor me for a second, the way that I see it is that there is obviously a larger, obviously to me, but there is a larger spirit world, and from which we come, that encompasses our world and many of the other universes that we live in. There is a soul, if you wish to call it. So the whole thing is the spirit. There should be a direct communication between the soul through the mind, which controls all of our mental and other abilities, down to the actual body who executes it. So in pure programmatical perspective, you have the soul or the spirit that chooses to accomplish certain tasks in the physical capacity, and the information gets passed through the mind to the body. When we only think of ourselves as the body, that information is more difficult for us to discern. So the whole goal of meditation, or the whole goal of going into self, is to remove the outside stimuli and to focus on that actual connection, so you're receiving the proper programmatic response. So you are allowing, in a way, you're allowing your soul to do what it actually wants to do in a life. So the connection, the way that I see it, is spirit down to mind, down to body. And when we are aligned, and when people are saying that they have achieved enlightenment, it's when they have achieved that balance and that straight line of communication, which always exists. We just choose to believe that we are disconnected from it and not listening to it. And we get confused and we bounce around if we are not connected. If we get back to that connection, everything is actually quite simple. And that's where we see the beautiful symmetry of life. That's where we see miraculous things that happen that we didn't expect, that we never tried to plan for. They just happen and we're wowed. That's what happens, and that's why it happens. So that's the way that I see the world, whether you choose to believe it or not.
Well said.
So with the art of allowing, from a relationship standpoint, would you say that, all relationships are great? It's just your perception on it, and if it ends, that was the lesson that you were supposed to get in that relationship?
Oh, well, that's a loaded question. Okay.
Probably never ask loaded questions.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get through it. It's very easy for us to jump out of something saying, well, we think it's over, right? Yeah, we were in love, and now we're out of love, and I believe that this is how I'm guided, and I'm going to get out of that. How do you know that you are, as opposed to staying in and working, as opposed to the contrary of you keep on working, you're thinking that this is what you're supposed to do, and you're guided towards it, and really your relationship is over, and that's the question. So there's no magic potion or spell that you can employ that'll tell you exactly what's happening, because we are humans after all. We have intuitive abilities, but we do not tend to use them very often. And when we use them, we doubt ourselves very much through the process. So in your original question, maybe it's over because it's supposed to be over, I agree. Some things are that. And let's remove the relationship, because all of us have very specific things that we tend to focus on when we think of relationships. Think of just people in your life. And you're going to find that throughout your life you have people coming in and out. You have friends who you were best of friends with at some point, and then all of a sudden they're out. And it's not really that you had a falling out or you hate each other now. They came in and then they came out. But then they came in at some point afterwards. Or you meet somebody and there's nothing happening, and then 5 years down the road you meet them again, and boom, there is that spark. It doesn't have to be a romantic spark, but it's just spark that you're meant to do something together. This is how things work. We are all in our lives for a specific instance, and relationships are no different. Now, some relationships are meant to last a lifetime. Some relationships are not. And it's up to us to figure out whether this particular one is the long-term one or whether it's not, and be okay with that. Which ones are supposed to be long and which ones are not? We keep on asking ourselves that question. But if we continue to do that, and if we continue to sit with ourselves and look as objectively as we can on it, then we can start getting some of those hints of whether this is the long one or whether this is just the one that we're supposed to let go and let the other person continue learning their lessons along the way.
Mm-hmm. I thought of that question because in the news, and it's been a couple of years now, but there was a big challenge, if you will, at a particular church. And what happened was guys and women were leaving their spouse because they were on Facebook reconnecting with like high school and college sweethearts. So it was more of like, were they allowing or looking back at what once was and hoping that the grass was greener?
It's possible, right? We all have a special place in our hearts for the first loves or the first infatuation or anything that we want to call it. I think the process of reconnecting is fine. What you choose to do after that is a different question, and the more important question to me is why. Right? If I think most of the marriages are broken up because people don't want to ask themselves the question of why am I unhappy, and they think that the happiness comes from outside of themselves. And when they start focusing on the outside, and that outside is not being provided by their current partner, they tend to believe that it could be provided by somebody else. Yeah. And maybe it will be, but not until you actually learn to love yourself. And I mean that quite literally. If you're waiting for love to come from somebody else, you're behind the 8 ball already. Yeah. You need to love yourself first, not because it's egotistic, but you need to love yourself first to allow and to understand how love from somebody else can actually be with you and not be reliant on it. That way you're not going to go and cheat on your spouse, because those 50% that stay together, how many of them are cheating? There's quite a large percent. Why do they do that? Right? They don't choose to break up their marriage for various reasons, but they're still unhappy. So the question is, what is driving them to that unhappiness, and what can they do about it? I choose to ask that question.
That's a good point. I think you might have answered. I was going to ask the question. Like me personally, I always have had the attitude that it's my responsibility for my happiness, not someone else's. So the question I was going to ask you is, come to you, are they kind of coming to you in that mindset that someone else has got to make me happy, and why is that not working? And I guess you kind of answered that and said, no, it's the other way around. You got to make yourself happy first. Correct?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And that realization kind of took a while coming to me, and it never fully crystallized until my best friend started going through a divorce process, and he told me I'm leaving because I'm not happy. And whereas I couldn't really get him to ask himself the questions of why he's unhappy, I started asking myself the question of, am I in my marriage because I love my wife or because she makes me happy? And that was a very, very powerful question to ask. And going through a long time of analyzing and meditating and understanding what the relationship was, and I got to the point of, it's not the other person who's supposed to make you happy. Like you said, it's you who is responsible for your own happiness, and you are married to the other person, hopefully because you love them, not because you want them to make you happy. And sorry for interrupting, but once you change that paradigm, then your relationship changes completely for the better.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of again, I love that catchphrase that you had, the algorithm for human interaction. And I'd like for you to talk about the preface in the New Love Triangle, because many people don't have that algorithm. In the preface, if I remember correctly, you were asking, upcoming clients or determining if they were going to be a good fit, what did they love about their lives? And then they mentioned everything but themselves. I'd love for you to go into greater detail about that.
Yeah, it's one of the first questions. What do you love about yourself? And the people are taken aback by that, because apparently we're not supposed to love ourselves, and it's a taboo topic. Well, I'm not supposed to say that. Other people are supposed to love me, but I can tell you what I like about myself, and that's a good starting point. But it's that part of people don't believe that they're supposed to love themselves. And we are always taught that we're supposed to love somebody else, but people are forgetting the other part of that statement. Love someone else as you love yourself. And that last part, we think as egotistical and we think as wrong to love yourself, because then we start going from there into an equation of, well, if you're loving yourself, then you're not focusing on somebody else, and you cannot give to somebody else because you already are taking for yourself, and you're elevating yourself above others, and you go in a completely different direction, which is not what this is meant to be. It's meant to be a simple understanding. And I'm going to use this example because I use that with my women clients as well. Since we're talking about triangles and relationships, and inevitably you've mentioned the adult topic, so we'll get to sex anyway. When a woman is learning how to pleasure herself, she really will not be able to do that with a partner because she needs to discover it on her own. She needs to know what works for her, what doesn't work for her, and then communicate that to her partner. But the loving herself in that regard comes first. Does that mean that she's not going to be able to love another? Absolutely not. That means that she'll be able to be better at it, and she'll be a lot more receptive, and she'll understand that if she can learn how to love herself, then she'll be respectful of the other person learning to love themselves. Now, I'm not equating love to sex as just a part of it, but loving yourself is a first component. So that's the part that we start with. And no, I don't start all of my coaching with, how are you doing in sex, and have you learned to pleasure yourself lately? It's a different concept, but it's basically, to me, love is acceptance. Love is acceptance, is understanding and self-awareness. And if somebody knows who they are, knowing what they think their faults are, but not dwelling on those and not hating themselves for it, that's starting to get to the love aspect. And nothing was as powerful in my experience as my 8-year-old. I have two kids, a 13-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. And my 8-year-old son recently came to me and said, I hate myself. And that was just a hammer to my head. I'm like, whoa, buddy, why? And he was talking about his appearance because, he gained some weight because he was eating lots of macaroni and cheese and pizza. And he became aware that, he doesn't have the six-pack anymore. And he started saying, I hate myself. And how many parents, and this is not to elevate myself in any way, but just asking the question of how many parents at that point teach the children not to hate themselves, but to love themselves? Yeah. How many parents, instead of just embracing and saying, you're perfect the way you are, and all of the other ones, really get into the depth of, do not say ever to yourself that you hate yourself, because that is the programming that will stay with you forever. Because you will utilize that in many, many perspectives. So I spent a long time with him making sure, and reading my book, you've seen that same statement. Don't be your own harshest critic. Be your own best friend. And your own best friend would never say anything about you being terrible or hating yourself. So to me, that was the most powerful, and I'm so thankful that I had all of my prep of going through it with myself, with my clients. So when my 8-year-old came to me, I was able to deal with it.
You're ready, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. It reminds me of, like you were saying, the art of allowing, and I know a lot of the Abraham talks, there's that conversation of being selfish versus selfless, and Abraham's like, we need to be more selfish and understanding more about ourselves. So it's kind of like, and we have so many distractions with electronics and everything that it's competing for our attention for every waking moment. Or you suggest, because you did mention, as an IT person, I appreciate it, as an IT person and a woo-woo, if you will, you are taking that time out to at least meditate and enjoy that peace and quiet so you can have that communication with the other realms that can see much more than we can. How did you get to that realization?
For me, it was a very, very simple thing and an extremely difficult all at the same time. And by the way, I love that you keep mentioning Abraham Hicks. I I'm a big fan as well. In terms of the simplicity of it, the way that I was programmed when I came here, I started writing poetry very early. Poetry for me, just as a disclaimer, is something that's rhyming. So the poetry that I write is rhyming only. Not poo-pooing any other poetry, just that's how I grew up. So I started writing poetry very early on, as early as age 7. And people were looking at it and saying, this is not written by a 7-year-old. And I learned, later on that when I was writing, I was really channeling. And I was getting into a state that's, for me, is very, very simple, a state of receiving information and then allowing, going through your allowing as well, allowing that information to flow onto paper. So for me, channeling, ability to communicate, kind of go within, was built in. It's a part of my DNA. Now, the other part of my DNA is being extremely lazy. So sitting myself down and forcing myself to meditate was very difficult for me because I had to overcome my own laziness of saying, well, I already do that every minute of every day. I don't need to do a special thing. In reality, we do. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't meditate most of the day anyway, because when you're in the shower, when you're brushing your teeth, if you are focused on inward communication, you're getting information. If you are paying attention to information that's flowing to you from every source, you're getting it anyway. But sitting yourself down, closing your eyes, and removing the external stimuli, in allowing silence to be present, really simplifies things. And that's why Abraham Hicks talks about that as well. The best times to meditate are in the morning when you are just awaking, when you're still kind of in that state where you're connected, and right before you go to sleep. And if you fall asleep, good. So meditation is really important. Last part on allowance, because you've mentioned that a couple of times, so I wanted to say something. To me, allowing is very different from pushing. And so that's the distinction that I make. Because to people, when we're explaining what allowing means, it's a difficult concept to grasp. But it's very easy to understand when you're pushing for something versus allowing it to happen. And then you get into the distinction of, that doesn't mean that you sit on your hands and do nothing. That just means that you're continuing on your journey without your energy killing you in the process because you are pushing so hard that you want so much that thing to happen that you're actually blocking the flow. Allowance is allowing for the flow to remain and then being one with it. So that to me is the allowance, and I try to use that in anything that I do to certain degree of success as it comes in.
I do remember that in the formative years, especially, going after the opposite sex, there was a saying that you're trying too hard, right? And you would never get the girl if you're trying too hard.
But it's perfectly correct, and the illustration of the continuation of that is that when you're already in a relationship, all of a sudden you become the hottest commodity. Same thing. You're looking for a job, you can't find one, and as soon as you land one, all 3 other places want you. It's the whole aspect of allowing. It's you not pushing. And all of a sudden the flow is open, and then those things start coming into your physical presence. So it's trying too hard. Again, getting back to my 8-year-old who has a girl that he likes, and she has a crush on him apparently, and he wants to have a date, and he went to a store to buy her presents. I'm like, dude, you're going too far, right? This little girl just after 2 years finally gave you a hint that she likes you. Don't do what I did when I was young. Don't surround her with all of the affection. Just allow things to happen naturally.
Yeah, on their own, exactly. Couldn't agree more.
That's funny. The other things that you're an Abraham fan, and you were talking about your son, they also make note of our approach to something, like you said, pushing versus allowing, our approach is somewhat backwards. So if we want to stop drugs, we shouldn't have a war on drugs or these different wars. We're just, because we're spending so much attention on them, they continue to permeate and maybe get worse in a lot of cases, as opposed to promoting the opposite of it. So instead of war, instead of promoting more love, then we wouldn't fight against war as much, so to speak.
I agree. And I'll preface this that, again, in our physical reality, at the level of emotional, psychological, and human intelligence that the world seems to be at, it works for certain things and doesn't work for other things. But if you ask me, I am a fan of legalization of drugs. I am a fan of legalization of prostitution. I am a fan of all of those things because I know people do that anyway. And I would rather it be safe. I would rather it not be something that we spend so much effort fighting, because people who want to try it are going to try it anyway. And then some of them are going to try it, and the forbidden fruit is not going to seem so tasty after they've tried it, and they're going to go back. Other people are going to get lost into it, and then you need somebody to help bring them out. I am a fan of allowing people to try things because it's a part of our human condition. That being said, there are checks and balances that need to be put in place because we're not at a point in our human evolution where we can handle a lot of that freedom. So It's a difficult balance to manage.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, David had alluded to it a little bit earlier when he was talking about outside the U.S. because it reminds me of going to Oktoberfest. And when you go to Germany for Oktoberfest, it's only Americans that are passed out in the street because they're trying to, right? They didn't have the access that the Germans and all the Europeans that go there. It's not a big deal, so I'll have a beer and enjoy the sights as opposed to, wow, look at all that, I gotta go crazy.
Yeah, it's very funny. It's true. It's the same thing with with sexuality or nudity in movies. When I was immigrating from the USSR to the United States, we actually went from USSR to Austria, and then from Austria to Italy, and then from Italy finally to the U.S. And the first thing that I saw in Austria, my parents and I were walking through a street, and we saw a beautiful scenery and a beautiful river, and a family of a young family with kids got completely undressed. They were nude and then they went swimming. And I thought, oh my God, where am I? Now, to me, that was a shock, but to Europeans, it's not a big deal. Nudity in movies is not a big deal. We make it a big deal, and we have a lot of sexual deviants that get off on it. But it's really about your aspect of understanding. Something that is a big deal, something that is prohibitive, people are going to want to do it. And we know that ourselves, and we know that with the children. You tell them not to do something, they're going to try to do that, just because you told them that's not okay. So it's something that we have to be open to and remove the guardrails, so to speak. Now, again, some people are going to try to take advantage of it and take advantage of those freedoms if we're allowing them. So it's a balance that needs to be maintained. But I'm certainly much more open to allowing people to experiment.
Since you are familiar with the movie Her, and we were talking a little bit about AI, I do want to give you a recommendation if you haven't seen it. There's a movie called Marjorie Prime. Are you familiar with that?
No, I have not.
Yeah, it's on Netflix. It came out this year. It's really good. It's actually Her came out in 2013, and this is more. It just came out this year, so it's more of what's the next phase. And in the story, you have Grandma. She's 85 plus years old. Her husband had passed 15 years prior, and before she transitions, she wants to spend some time with him. And you would think she'd want to spend some time with him while they're the same age. And that wasn't the case. She wanted to spend time with her husband when they first met, because that was, he was in his 40s or 30s, And so his AI was in the image of him as a 30-year-old man, and she would have a conversation with him. And it kind of helped her in her later years because she continued to have a relationship and that she didn't have otherwise. You know, her son and her daughter can only meet some of her, you know, her demands at on a certain level. They didn't have that connection that she and her husband had. So it's just really interesting. I think you'll like it from an IT technology, where's it going standpoint.
Very cool. I wrote that down. I'll check it out.
What was the name of the game again?
Marjorie Prime.
Marjorie Prime. Okay.
Yeah, it should be on Netflix. So we're at the top of the hour, Allen, and it was great speaking with you, but I do want to give you some time to talk about your book, and I'm happy that you do have an audiobook coming out for this because I'm more of an audio fan, listen to everything in 2X, so I'm looking forward to that. And tell us your social media and how people can get in touch with you.
Thank you very much. And by the way, guys, I really enjoyed the hour. Thank you so much for that. The easiest way to get in touch with me is going to the newlovetriangle.com. Just type in the name of the book, which is the address of the site, and all of the links are there. If you forget it, just type in Allen Vaysberg in Google. There are only two of us. One is a very nice lawyer in L.A., and I'm the other guy. Fantastic. Well, guys, you've been tuned to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And we definitely appreciate you coming on our podcast today, Allen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
Cheers.
Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.